Now on BBC2 Bookmark, which tonight looks at murder as a subject for serious writers. Much of the film examines the relationship between writer Brian Masters and murderer Dennis Nilsen, which resulted in a prize-winning book. Where the crimes are mentioned, the material used is from news bulletins and public records. But in assessing Nilsen's motivation for his crimes, the film does have a potentially disturbing impact.
Nilsen's flat was what I would call a typical bachelor pad. The cooker needed a woman's attention. It was thick with grease. The rooms were a little Spartan. But there was an odd sensation in there because I could smell decomposing flesh. All of the windows were open, and yet it was February and it was snowing outside. The place was clearly damp. This was because he'd been trying to get rid of some of the smells that were lingering in the flat.
When Dennis Andrew Nilsen was jailed for life in 1983, the largest mass murder case in British legal history came to an end. In tonight's bookmark, we examine the unique relationship that grew up between the murderer Nilsen and writer Brian Masters.
From D.A. Nilsen, Her Majesty's Prison, Brixton, 30th of March, 1983. Dear Mr. Masters, I pass the burden of my past and actions onto your shoulders. Although I have been a hard-bitten cynic, I still have not fully learned the lessons of professional life, and still extrude a seemingly naive innocence in my dealings with relative strangers. I have reason to believe that, on balance, you would diligently apply your efforts to produce the most detailed and accurate history of this type of case that has ever been produced. This calls for the kind of integrity which I am sure is your style. The commitment you make should be primarily for the good of society and the literary arts.
Fairly shortly after Nilsen had been appearing at the Magistrates' Court on remand, Brian Masters, I think, it's a long time ago now, 8 years I think, telephoned me and told me who he was and that he'd been authorised by Dennis Nilsen to write this book about Nilsen. And so I confirmed that with Nilsen, and I had Nilsen's specific written instructions. In fact, as far as I recall, I actually contacted the Law Society because it had never happened before.
Well, I heard on the Fleet Street grapevine that an author by the name of Brian Masters, a name unknown to me at the time, had approached the Home Office with a view to getting in touch with Nilsen in order to write a book about the events. Now, this concerned me initially, mainly because it was an unprecedented thing to happen. I was also concerned that it might perhaps interfere with the course of justice, because this man hadn't yet been tried. And when he came to see me here at Hornsey Police Station, I did try very hard to talk him out of going ahead with it. In fact, I tried to convince him that he was entering an area which was so evil that he might not be able to handle it.
One thing I didn't know was that you're not allowed to write to the prisoner when he's on remand awaiting trial on a capital case like this. Because I didn't know I couldn't do it, I did it. The letter went through the censor, but the censor was too busy or whatever to notice that I was a writer. He had just assumed that it was a letter from a friend, I suppose. He assumed that I must have known him. I asked in my letter whether I could see him, because I said I was interested in writing a book on the case, but I wouldn't do it without his consent and authority. This was simply because there would be no point in doing it. I wasn't going to do something which was stitching together various newspaper accounts. One would only do it properly if one had access to the man, and if there was no access, then I wouldn't do it.
Killing for Company is Brian Masters' first book on crime. He's better known for his highly praised literary biographies and histories of the British aristocracy.
Come on, come down. Well, like everybody else, I opened the newspaper that morning in 1983 at breakfast and read that a man had been arrested on suspicion of having murdered a number of people. The details of the case weren't clear, but it was pretty obvious that it was going to be very gruesome. I'd never written a book on a criminal case. I'd never had any training in criminal psychology or the history of crime, but I did think that it was very likely a terrific comment on the society in which we live now, that such a thing was possible, that these men could disappear and not be noticed, that their disappearance would pass unchallenged, as it were. And then I think I read in the paper, one of the papers, a report that he was reading the complete works of Shakespeare or something. And he had also been alleged to have cut the bodies of his victims up into pieces and flushed them down the lavatory and boiled the heads on the kitchen stove. And the juxtaposition of a boiling head and the Shakespeare sonnet was so intriguing and so unusual that I became even more interested.
Okay. So, situations like this. 1:10 last night, son asleep, Trink over there, me here. What happens? Crash, bang, what? Have a look there. Move the camera up there. Have a look at that. Right? Look at the state of that. Whole bloody ceiling falls down. Falls down on me for a start. Rips straight across, hits the dog, poor old pooch. Blood cheek goes up. Big row. That wakes you up as well. Okay? Have a look at this. Great chunks. Bloody great chunks of masonry. I mean, you could kill somebody. Listen to that. Bloody dick, cut this now. Have a look at this down here. Here's it's everywhere. All the carpet. This is my carpet, incidentally. The landlord didn't pay for that. Masses and masses of lumps. You got to live like this. 15 quid a week. And look, this poor bastard over here. Oh, wait.
If you're writing a biography of the Duchess of Devonshire, you get all the archive material you can, her letters, diaries, references to her, and you build up a picture of somebody and of somebody's life from that archive material, and it's up to you to then shape it. I treated it exactly as I would have treated an 18th century subject. And what I wanted to do, and did very ruthlessly, was a detached, objective study of Nilsen. I never felt peculiar in his presence. He furiously wrote for 8 months, practically all day and every day, about his past, about his childhood, his parents, his grandparents, his feelings, his attitudes, his work. And all this was a necessary thing for him to somehow rid himself of the nastiness and the wickedness into which he had fallen. So, in a sense, yes, he was using me, I suppose, as a confessor.
Well, Mr. Masters, about 5 years ago, contacted me. He told me he's a biographer, and he's writing the life of someone. He didn't tell me who. And would I be prepared to analyze that writing for him and tell him whatever I can? I thought that this man has potential to be dangerous. So I did tell him I want him. Actually, I remember I told him to avoid finding himself in a lift with this man alone. Well, the first thing is that the color of the writing, but by that I don't mean the blue. I mean the blackness. It is dark, it's dense, intense, the whole writing. It leaves no breathing space between the written masses. It's too compact. The compactness is the suffocation of the soul. His soul is corseted. It's as if he's wearing something terribly tight around his soul that keeps him from expanding, from communicating. And that has also enhanced his storytelling talent, his writer's talent. But it has never been channeled properly. He has never been helped, guided.
You remember that book I was always going on about, In Cold Blood?
Mm.
Yes, I like that one.
You read it?
Oh, yes.
A long time ago.
Yes. But what was it you were saying about the fact that he mucked about with the floating up the narrative?
I think, do you remember, I think it was the first book, which was called Faction, a mixture of fact and fiction.
Yes.
What he did was cover the case of these two boys in the Midwest who were accused of murder, and then write a book which was based on the case, but wasn't an exact reproduction of it. In other words, he invented conversations, he invented scenes between them, he invented part of their past life and so on, in order to create the fictional framework which was convincing to him.
Oh, I see. Oh, I see what you mean. So you don't actually mean he tampered with the case. He
didn't tamper with the evidence in the case, but he added to it.
He did it
very
very well,
to it.
didn't he?
I mean, it was a very clever book, but it was a cheat in a way.
I thought he got it all from the family.
No. A lot of it was invented. And I wonder whether that's a correct thing to do, actually. I mean, correct is hardly the word, but I mean, either you're going to write something which is purely objective and detached and factual, or you're going to write a work of fiction.
Real-life crime writing in its various forms is the accepted way of studying that most fascinating of subjects, murder. But can fiction be a better way of getting into a murderer's mind? One writer who spent his early life at Broadmoor, where his father was governor, is Patrick McGrath. This experience gave him an unusual insight into the mind of the criminal psychopath. His latest novel, Spider, deals with a schizophrenic murderer.
As a novelist, I've always been interested in the unreliable narrator and working within that sort of gap between the teller and the tale. I think it's not terribly interesting simply to tell a story. It becomes much more interesting when you have a character who is telling you this story, and that account cannot be trusted, that hints are given to the reader that they're being told a story that's not altogether true, or maybe a complete tissue of lies. When you're dealing with a psychotic character, of course, you know, the unreliability becomes much more pronounced, and this was the case with Spider. He begins to tell us this story of this terrible love triangle and the ghastly effects of it. But it's clear as signs of his own mental disturbance become more and more pronounced that we can't really take anything that he said on trust.
I determined that the best route of discovery was to start in northeast Scotland, where Nilsen was born. I thought it would be more interesting to search back into the ancestry of this man, discover what produced him and what were the component parts of his history. So I came up to Fraserburgh, where he and all his antecedents derived, to find what sort of people lived here, how they lived, in what kind of atmosphere, and to go on from there to discover what sort of childhood he might have had. Not to excuse or to expose or to elaborate, but to understand. Because the law can't understand beyond the question of guilt or innocence. This is a very rugged, harsh, and demanding part of the world to live in. First of all, it's open, exposed to the elements, not only the sea, but the wind which buffets this part of the world constantly, so that the people have to be very hardy, both in spirit and in body, and this is translated in their character, because they are radical nature people, they're iconoclastic, they're independent, you don't see much coziness, much hand-holding. Nilsen's mother, Betty Fyte, was an extremely popular girl here in the war years. She was young, pretty, vivacious, loved to go to cafes, loved to talk. In fact, she could hardly stop, and especially liked to go dancing. The whole atmosphere here changed in the war when the fishing village people had suddenly finding themselves to mix with foreign soldiers. After the Nazi invasion of Norway, way out over there, the place was invaded, was peopled with the vast number of foreign soldiers, especially Norwegians. And one evening, one of these Norwegian soldiers rescued young Betty from an altercation with another man who was trying to talk to her when she didn't want to talk to him. And they fell in love immediately, and they married. It was not a marriage which should ever have happened, as she later admitted. It was based entirely on a romantic notion, and of course he was hardly ever here. They had 3 children, Olaf, Sylvia, and finally Dennis. But Dennis never met him, doesn't remember anything of him. Betty had to bring up the 3 children alone. She had no marital home. They never had a home together, she and her husband. But she continued to live with her parents, Andrew and Lily White. And so the 3 children were brought up really by the grandparents. The only adult male company Nilsen had as a child was that of his grandfather, Andrew White. He became young Dennis's surrogate father and was probably the only person to show the boy any tactile affection.
I remember being borne aloft on the tall, strong shoulders of my great hero and protector, my grandfather. He would make me a dragon, as he called it. It was a kite made from brown paper or newspaper, and small, thin, supple branches tied or sewn with string. There were open fields beyond Dennyduff Road, where we would test and fly the kite. Windy days were frequent up in Fraserburgh. Grandad would also take me around the harbour, and on board the herring boats and to the repair slipway. I would see the herring boats being built, entirely of wood, in the boat-building yards.
There's nothing cosy about the cemeteries in the northeast of Scotland here. They're very bleak. Indeed, the sea, which is the permanent enemy, is just beyond the wall, and the cemetery is like an admission to the sea of defeat. There's not a single family in these villages who hasn't lost one or even 5 or 6 menfolk at sea. So it was the source of all their life, and it was eventually the source of their death. The Nilsen family were no exception to that ruthless law.
I remember being in the large bed with my older brother and younger sister in the living room, and my mother saying, "Do you want to see your granddad?" We were then carried one by one into the small room where we had been born, lifted up and held to peer into the open coffin set on trestles. Grandad was wearing glasses and expensive long johns. He was barefooted and needed a shave. He looked as if he was sleeping.
Nobody had explained to the 6-year-old boy that his grandfather had died of a heart attack at sea. He was now bereft of all male affection. The grandfather was the one person whom he always looked forward to seeing, and he had gradually to work out for himself what this shock, what this vision meant to him. But it did, I think, at that moment fuse 2 deep emotions in his life, disastrously, catastrophic results. His idea of love, represented by the grandfather, and his idea of death became intertwined.
Many years ago, I was a boy drowning in the sea. I'm always drowning in the sea, down amongst the dead men, deep down. There is peace in the sea, back down to our origins. When the last man has taken his last breath, the sea will still be remaining. It washes everything clean. It holds within it forever the boy suspended in its body, and the streaming hair and the open eyes.
What made the book different from any other book, I think, of this kind, is that the relationship which grew up between the subject and the author. Nilsen very early learnt, I think, that he could trust me, that I was not somebody who was going to simply pore over the gory details of what he'd done, but was going to try to look into possible explanations, elucidations.
With a man like Nilsen, I suppose we must be mistrustful. We must be skeptical. We must be incredulous, as we must be with each other, really, I think, all the time, because each one of us, when he gives his or her account of what happened, is going to give an account that is biased by their own projections. I mean, there is no fact, only interpretation.
Dennis Nilsen spent the early part of his adolescence here in Stricken. His mother had moved here to Stricken with her new husband and had started a new family. He had 4 stepbrothers and stepsisters. But his isolation continued and, in fact, deepened. He became much more of a radical than one would have expected. He was full of anger. And it seemed to some of the teachers here at this school that his anger must have been an expression, a sublimation, if you like, of an anger which he felt within himself. And indeed, his emotional isolation was stronger than ever before. There was no best friend. He seems to have completely avoided that part of adolescence which involves the first emotional attachments. He was attached to a boy whom he used to see in the playground, who was a friend of his sister's, but he never spoke to him. It was always from afar, from a distance. And he also found himself peculiarly taken by the illustration in his French book, the illustration of a boy used for French grammar. Again, an inanimate object, somebody with whom he had no real contact. There was not a single person to whom he could say, "You're my chum," or with whom he would link arms walking down the street. And so he took refuge, first of all, in radicalism, and secondly, in the army. At the age of 14, he joined the cadet force here at the school, and at the age of 15, with a fairly good academic record, he felt he had to escape, and the army was his means of escape.
By the time Dennis Nilsen left school, he was sexually innocent, emotionally untried. He had no best friend, no exciting discoveries with other boys, no desire to unravel the mysteries of girls. His emotions had only been tested in ways where safety from rejection was ensured.
I remember standing on the platform on the hill at Stricken railway station. I had a shabby suitcase and a raincoat. I was 15 years old. It was raining. The great steam train arrived and took me puffing slowly off to the start of a new life. I never looked back, and the old images and the mists lifted as the bright blue sky appeared ahead of me. I left Aberdeen on the Aberdonian overnight express for King's Cross. I was impressed crossing the Tay Bridge, with the tragic stumps of the fallen old bridge still there. The next morning we arrived in London. There I took the train to Aldershot, and a taxi up to St. Omer Barrack, Apprentice Chef's Wing, Army Catering Corps, A Company, Junior Leaders Regiment.
Nilsen enjoyed the army, but the happiness of these years was compromised by one increasingly serious preoccupation. While still at Aldershot, he'd been aware of being attracted to various other boys, and of the obvious need to repress these sexual longings. The repression carried with it a concomitant feeling of guilt, for if his desires needed to be hidden, then there must be something wrong with them. He thought of himself as bisexual rather than homosexual, and as he was not in any way effeminate, it was relatively easy for him to dissemble. It was in the army that Nilsen learnt his butchering skills.
What the writer of a non-fiction crime book, what he normally does, is to prod the reader into thinking and feeling in a certain way by using Turkey carpet style adjectives, horrific adjectives, and does not let you have your own judgment or feel your own emotions. It's as if they don't trust the reader to understand what he's going through at the time of the reading. Because in any work of art, the reader contributes as much as the writer, or should do. It should be a combined experience.
Brian Masters actually started off with an established horror. These murders had been committed. Dennis Nilsen existed in the public mind. He then starts with the horror, and objectively, really, from the outside, he then takes us through the horror into the human being. And in that way, I think we begin to understand Dennis Nilsen.
Right, hang on a second. Stick that somewhere. I'll quick beer. Got some little compensation in life.
After leaving the army in 1972, Nilsen joined the police as a cadet in Hendon, North London. Although he was to make his home in this area, the police force was not to his liking. The choice of a career in the police can only have been faute de mieux for a man who was more and more disgruntled with the exercise of authoritarian power. He left the police after 10 months and joined the civil service, working in the hotel and catering division of the Job Centre in Denmark Street, Soho.
He was a pain in the neck most of the time, and most of his colleagues regarded him as a pain in the neck most of the time. He had some interesting ideas, but he also had an irritating habit of repeating them again and again. Many people regarded him as a bore. They could see that he was a complicated character. Some people enjoyed his company, very happy to have a drink with him in the pub in the evening. But for most people, he talked incessantly, and they just wished he would go away. I think most people regarded him as a person without any personal life. Except his dog. He talked about his dog. Very fond of his dog.
His dog, Bleep, was his only real companion. What little social life he had was restricted to inconsequential encounters with a flow of pickups found in various pubs. All were anonymous and never seen again. Sometimes Nilsen would accompany the man to his house or flat. Sometimes he would bring him home to his own tiny room.
Sex in its natural place is like the signature at the end of a letter. Written on its own, it is less than nothing. Signatures are easy to sign, good letters far more difficult. Anonymous sex only deepens one's sense of loneliness and solves nothing. Promiscuity is a disease. It's like compulsive gambling. You know what you will lose, but you go on nevertheless.
One evening in November 1975, he saw a young man being pestered by two older men outside a pub. He intervened and took the man home by taxi. His name was David Gallichan. He was about 20 years old, blonde, with earrings and a hint of makeup. He stayed the evening with Nilsen, and they agreed next morning that they would try a permanent relationship together.
He's ready, Dad. Yeah, okay, come in a minute. That TV went again this morning. Yeah, now it's not useless, isn't it? Because what time we put it back? It is. You got to sign on, are you? Tom? I got to sign on. I already am going to sign on today. I'll sign on again. Where's that bloody dog? Been chewing my slippers again. Here it is. Chewing your slippers, I give it. Chewing your slippers? Like, what about me? Is he biting my cardigan again? I'll wring his bloody neck if I catch it again. Yeah. Oh, piss on the carpet again and shit it down here. The only saving grace in this bloody hovel at the moment is the garden. Dog, come on, stop. And the reason for this is that when we came here, this back garden was like a bloody rubbish heap with tons of old cookers and tires and debris and plaster and wood and God knows what else. It was completely overgrown with rubbish. And we, the good old tenant, trying to improve the property, in 3 months managed to move it out next door and make it what it is now. Look at it, it's quite neat and tidy. There's a little fence there. There's vegetables in abundance growing. And what else can I say? I'm so bloody annoyed I have to think about this. Cut off.
What's your own idea of why he wanted you to do it particularly? I mean, I know you asked him if you could.
Yeah,
why did he suddenly? Why was he so? I mean, lots of murderers approach would sort of say.
Well, I think there's one reason which is professional, and one reason which I think is probably emotional. In a professional sense, I mean, he after all wasn't an executive officer at the Job Centre. He was used to sizing people up. He recognised, I think, pretty quickly that I was not a hack journalist who was only interested in a sensational report and then would then forget it. And that if I was going to do it, it was going to be searching. So I think he had enough experience to spot that immediately. And had he thought that it was going to be simply a sensational nonsense, he would have not wanted to have anything to do with it. Secondly, he also spotted that I was the sort of chap who could be relied upon to go on visiting him after the job was over.
Did he want you to put his point of view? He didn't really, did he?
Don't think so. I think he was scrupulously honest about that.
Yeah.
He always said that he must never interfere with the way the book was going to be written or whatever. All that he would do was dredge up as many members as he could of the childhood and the time as in the army and so on. Not always talking about the murders, though he did occasionally, when the mood took him, he started to write about the actual crimes. And it was up to me to sift through all this and use what I thought was important and instructive. But he never interfered with it.
Hello, Honky Tonk. How are you? This makeup bloke's very good, isn't he? You're a great pillock, Twinkle. God almighty, let's have a little smile, then. Come on, have a little smile.
But the fragile relationship between Nilsen and Galichan broke up because it was so relentlessly artificial. Nilsen had invented it, and Galichan, Twinkle as he was known, allowed himself to be part of that invention. There was no deep bond of affection between them.
Quick, I run out of film. A whole leg. I can't understand you. I ask you to start filming from the feet slowly up to the head. And you go zip, pan. Bloody hell, don't you ever watch movies? You must see thousands of movies. You must know what it's like. The training chimpanzees at Cape Canaveral to operate a camera. Anybody can do it.
Good riddance, eh, Bleep? He didn't turn out to be nice, did he? We had to tell him to go. He was such a dull bastard. He was a dull bastard, wasn't he? Promiscuous bastard. He was no friend of ours, was he, girl?
There are people who write about the theory and the psychiatry of murder who say that, and I believe this to be true, that a murderer often commits murder in order to prevent something worse from happening. Now, the something worse that might happen is the disintegration of one's own personality. And I think at the time of the murder, it is very likely that there's some terrible surge which threatens to destroy you. And to control it, you destroy something else. Having said that, it obviously gave him satisfaction to do this, and he did it 15 times. So it can't be excused as something over which he had absolutely no control.
I go out in search of company. When I voluntarily go out to drink, I do not have the intention at that time to do these things. Things may happen afterwards, drink-wise, but they are not foreplanned. I seek company first, and hope everything will be all right.
Between 1978 and 1981, Nilsen took home 12 young men he met in casual encounters in various pubs in the West End and Camden Town, got drunk and strangled them. After keeping the corpses around the flat for company for a week or so, he cut up the bodies, burnt the remains, and buried them in the back garden of 195 Melrose Avenue.
We spent a long time before the trial trying to work out what his motives could possibly be. After his conviction, he said, "Oh, I've got to come clean with you, Brian. I should have told you before, but I did it because I enjoyed it." I said, "I know you enjoyed it. You don't kill 15 times if it's a bore. I mean, if you didn't enjoy it the first time, you wouldn't have done it again. I want to know why you enjoyed it." And he said, "Oh, I can't work that out. You'll have to work that one out." But he admitted, which was perfectly obvious, that it was something which he felt at the moment of the crime to be a compulsion which gave him some satisfaction.
My remorse is of a deep and personal kind which will eat away inside me for the fear. I strangled his struggling body, and when he was dead, I uncovered the body and took it by the ankles. I pulled it up through the gap in the floor, opposite the dead youth, and just stared at him. It was the beginning of the end of my life.
He said lots of very contradictory things. He would say that he didn't know that he was going to do them, that he couldn't remember the actual moment of the death. He could remember events leading up to it. would say that he'd drunk too much, and then on another day he'd say, well, I have to admit that I did it because I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the chase, I enjoyed the whole business of prey and predator. And it was up to me to sort out what was true and untrue, or if you prefer, as the French classicists would say, what is probable and improbable. What is probable is more true than what is true. And using one's experience as a writer, given that archive raw material, I had then to decide what I thought the truth was, or what I thought the ultimate probability was. Now, I could have been wrong. I might still be wrong, I suppose, but I don't think so. And I don't think I don't think a lawyer or a journalist or even a psychiatrist would have been able to come to these conclusions. I think it does need the intuition of a writer to work out what is reliable and what isn't reliable.
I rub my eyes to make them bloodshot. I put powder on my face to erase the living colour. I smear charcoal under my eyes to accentuate a dark, hollow look. I put pale blue on my lips. I have a mixture of cochineal and saffron to synthesize blood. I let the blood run from my nose and mouth. I lie staring-eyed on the bed in front of the mirror. I stare in fascination at my body. There is another imaginary person in the room who finds my body out in the woods. This other person, an old hermit, drags my dead body back to his shack. It is one bare room. Struggling with my dead weight, he lays me on the bed, then stops and stares at me, lifeless. He decides that I have no further use for my clothes, then removes my shirt. His hands caress my still body. He's speaking to me as though I was still alive.
There are those who say, whether one referring to a book of fiction or of non-fiction, that this area of interest is purely morbid, a desire to find out who hacked the Brighton trunk murder or the ghastly details. And actually these people, pleasant as they may be to meet on the grounds of the hospital, have committed untold misery to some other people you can't see. Is it a legitimate area of concern for the fiction writer or the non-fiction writer?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's you know, it's human experience, and therefore comes very much within the general purview of the novelist. And I think you can make a strong argument that well, there, but for the grace of God, go you or I. That had the chips fallen differently, any one of us might have been afflicted with a psychotic illness, have become you know, filled with delusions of persecution, and hallucinations and a sort of completely distorted take on reality, in which we might well have found it absolutely essential and logically necessary to do a great deal of damage to somebody close to us. If you're careful, if you're skillful, you can lead the reader to understand that one can move outside of the normal moral limits of ordinary life without, in the process, sacrificing one's humanity, without sacrificing the reader's sympathy, that there is a way in which people can be driven to these extremes, and that there is a sort of a logic to it, and a necessity.
Nilsen moved to 23 Cranley Gardens in September 1981. 3 more killings took place before his arrest. Once he had finished with the corpses and having no garden available, he cut them up and flushed them down the lavatory piece by piece. The heads he boiled on the kitchen stove. There had been several more murder attempts where he was either fought off or had managed to snap out of his killing trance before it was too late.
I felt something around my neck. It was sort of like I couldn't breathe or anything, and I felt sort of around the back of my neck to see what it was. I mean, I presume that I got caught up in a sleeping bag, which Nilsen had sort of warned me about before I went to bed. And I sort of felt his hands. At first I thought he was sort of like helping me out of it, but he sort of shouted, sort of whispered, sort of keep still. And I sort of passed out. And then I sort of vaguely remember hearing water running and sort of vaguely being carried into what I presume a bathroom. And I felt very cold.
Of course one can't feel sympathy for a man who squeezes the life out of another man with a tie from behind. No way. It's impossible. But to understand how his life could disintegrate to such a point that this became not only possible but imperative for him, to understand why, is to understand something of the human condition. And it is cowardly not to understand. It is cowardly to say, I don't want to know because I'm going to feel sympathy. It's terrible, it's bloody, it's disgusting, and that's enough for me. I don't want to go any further.
Nilsen was not schizophrenic, but was rather a psychopath, so he didn't have all of these florid symptoms. I think it's a much more subtle condition there. His complete lack of, I suppose, remorse and compassion after these murders is what is so disturbing. But again, if we are thinking in terms of a pathology here, a psychopathology, it in a way makes it easy to understand and even to love Dennis Nilsen, if we understand that what happened to him produced a certain condition in which these actions then became not only possible but necessary for him. And that is within the bounds of human experience. This happens to people.
But real life was overtaking fantasy. Events moved quickly when other tenants in the house complained about the funny smells and blocked drains. The man from Dynorod arrived on the 8th of February 1983.
On lifting the manhole, the smell was terrific. Well, I won't say terrific, it's the wrong word, but certainly a stench, shall we say, of decaying flesh, like an abattoir, like a slaughterhouse.
Well, I was sitting in my office, it was a Wednesday morning, back in February 1983. It was a bitterly cold day, and I was checking the diaries of the CID staff, and I had a phone call, and I was asked to go up to 23 Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill, and I drove there alone, where I met the uniformed inspector, who was the early turn duty officer, and he pointed out some drains at the side of the house which had been blocked, and pieces of flesh had been pulled out and some bones, and he asked me to look at them to see what I thought. And the pieces of flesh could have been anything, but the bones that I saw were about 3 inches long and had a knuckle at each end, and looked to me as if they were from a human hand.
Nilsen knew the game was up, and his own complicity in bringing about the end cannot be ignored.
The night before, I'd thought of dumping the remains left in my flat, but decided to leave everything exactly where it was. I even thought an arrest might not come until the next morning. By the time I arrived home on the evening of the 9th of February, I was tired and prepared for what lay ahead.
It had occurred to me that one didn't have to be the world's greatest detective to realize that anyone who killed somebody and cut him up into small pieces and flushed him down the loo was going to be a bit odd. And I had to make a decision as to whether to deal with him firmly as he came in through the door or slightly light-heartedly. And I decided to go for the light-hearted approach. And when he did come in, I introduced myself to him, and with a slight smile on my face, I said to him, I've come about your drains.
Nilsen admitted 15 murders. Some of the remains of the last 3 were still in the flat when the police arrived, hidden in black polythene dustbin liners in the wardrobe and in the bathroom. The problem the police had was to find the remains of the other 12 killed while Nilsen was living at Melrose Avenue, and to this day, some of the bones remain unidentified. Of course, it would be grotesque that a writer, in writing about such hideous crimes, should somehow find himself glorifying the criminal. But I had to remind him and myself of the enormous gulf that separates him from the rest of mankind. And it wasn't easy, because he's a supremely logical man. And he said that people are horrified by what he did to the corpses, cutting them up and disposing of them in that way. And he says, "You're horrified too, aren't you?" I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Well, your morals are all wrong." I said, "What do you mean by that?" He said, "Well, now look, the wicked thing I did, the unforgivable thing I did, was to squeeze the life out of somebody living. For that there is no redemption. But I can't hurt a corpse. A corpse is an object. No harm can be done to it. If you are more horrified by what I did to the bodies than what I did to living people, then your morals are upside down." And of course it does give one pause for thought, but it clarifies the difference between him and the rest of humanity.
So tonight, Dennis Nilsen begins a lifetime behind bars. The jury finally concluded that he's not out of his mind or suffering from diminished responsibility, but that he is a cold-blooded murderer. Indeed, it was his state of mind which became the central issue at the trial, an issue which Nilsen himself was still pondering during the last few weeks.
My case has produced a series of delayed emotional and moral shocks as the mind slowly accumulates the enormity of events. I cannot see how I can ever make amends for anything which I may have done in the past. I think that I am two stark, contrasting poles of man's character. I have played the angel's role unimpeachably, balanced disastrously by momentary and uncontrollable outbursts of primitive evil.
Something I just can't understand this. I've tried and I've thought about it and thought about it. You just must be sick or something. Because it's not the Dennis I knew that's doing this.
I think for both these characters, for Nilsen and for Spider, that there is a tremendous sense of guilt at the root of all of it. And that guilt has to do with the experience of the death of a loved one at an early age. And both of their later psychoses grew out of a failure properly to integrate that experience into their personalities, and failure to adapt to that.
It's so difficult to tell, isn't it? Because if you talk to anybody, I'm quite certain Himmler was probably pretty nice, wasn't he? I mean, when once you got to know him, fond of dogs and all that. And it's not. I mean, poor old Nilsen. Well, I say poor old Nilsen. I'm not sorry for Nilsen in the slightest. And when I read the book, I didn't think, oh, poor fellow. I just think everybody is so capable of more or less doing the same thing if you happen to be a certain sort of person in a certain set of circumstances.
The streets give me no comfort. Everything is losing colour, becoming bleached and dry. The weather is part of it. A string of these cold, clear days when the light is so strong and bright that my eye has no warm pockets of colour or shadow or dampness into which it can slip for safety. There is always this glare now. The streets and walls and windows all look hard, like metal, the way they push white light back at me and make my poor eyes dart this way and that to escape it. So I go down Kitchener Street and while away the hours in the Dog and Beggar. One visit I remember vividly, when I became aware of a thought pattern not my own. Everything I touch dies. If you love me, you die. If I touch you, you die. Everything I love dies.
I'm constantly asked why I still visit him, because the book was published years ago now. But to me it seems such an odd question, because I can't imagine not doing so. The alternative is to say to him, well, thank you very much. You've written 50 prison journals. It's given me a massive and wonderful archive on which I could work. It's enabled me to write a book which has won a prize. It's done wonders for my reputation. I've earned some money out of it. Well, that's about it, I think. Now you can rot. Goodbye. Shake hands, and that's the end.
Here in the Hall of Plenty, there is nothing now. Just you lying under my hands. with shadowy figures approaching with some formalities to take you into their system. And me. Think over the lonely life of you. It is tomorrow soon enough, and they will meddle in our business.